Well, now I think it's good afternoon now. I see that the conference is proceeding very well with rather strict adjustment to the schedule, which is perfect. Well, it is a pleasure for me to introduce our keynote speaker, David Lipton. Although most of you don't need an introduction to David Lipton, allow me to say a few words. David Lipton is the first Deputy Managing Director of the IMF since September 2011. He holds a PhD in economics from Harvard University and has developed an outstanding professional career both in the private and public sector. Just before joining the fund, he was appointed Special Assistant to President Obama and served as Senior Director for International Economic Affairs, both at the National Economic Council and at the National Security Council. Previously, during the 90s, he served in the Clinton administration, the Treasury Department, becoming Undersecretary for International Affairs. He has also extensive experience in the private sector and as economic advisor to different governments and countries in transition to market-oriented economies. It is really a privilege for us to have him today as our keynote speaker. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Governor Linde. Good afternoon, everyone. I've been looking forward to this conference for some time. I think it's been a great morning. First, let me say thanks to Governor Linde and his colleagues here at the Banco de España for their hospitality and for co-hosting with us from the IMF this conference on Spain's journey from recovery from crisis to resilience, and I would add to renewed confidence. I think there are many useful lessons that one can draw from Spain's experience. So it's fitting that we come together to reflect on the challenges that have been overcome and the challenges ahead as Spain builds on its important and impressive economic gains. Over the past 20 years, I think that the world has learned the hard way that it's best to be alert to the possibility that there may be crisis around the corner. And that's taught us a couple of things. First, the importance of having strong buffers, something we've already heard a lot about this morning. Buffers that enable a country to respond to big shocks. That means maintaining strong defenses, like healthy fiscal buffers and robust capital levels in the financial system as well. But I think we've also learned that defense is not enough. So the second lesson is to make institutions and markets flexible enough to ensure more resilient and more speedy recoveries once there are problems. I think that was a key takeaway from this morning's session on fiscal policies and the session on labor markets you just heard. All countries will need resilience and flexibility to respond to a world changing at a breakneck speed, driven by technology, driven by globalization. And what this means, I think, in practice is creating a policy framework to encourage and to make the most of innovation and economic dynamism by facilitating experimentation, but at the same time ensuring that people's skills and markets and institutions are flexible enough to absorb the inevitable creative destruction that the future holds. I'll return to both of these subjects in a minute, but let me say a few words at this point about the European setting. IMF Managing Director Christine Lagarde spoke in Berlin just a week ago about European integration, both the successes and the remaining gaps in the euro area's financial architecture. Those included the need to create unified capital markets, to complete banking union, and to establish a central fiscal capacity. She advocated a rainy day fund, as was discussed this morning. Building these buffers at the European level are a key unfinished agenda item for Europe. Strengthening the architecture of the euro area has been and remains a key priority for all European countries because each has a stake in a healthy and prosperous Europe. But none of that relieves individual national governments of the responsibility for addressing vulnerabilities in their own sphere and promoting higher levels of growth and well-being for their citizens. And that's essentially what I'd like to focus on for the rest of my talk today, how national policies have been essential to recovery within the policy framework that's been established by the euro area. So let's start by taking a look back at how Spain responded to adversity over the past decade, and take note of Spain's significant economic achievements, most notably the resurgence of international competitiveness. Spain's experience demonstrates what can be gained when a country's leaders work with common purpose to increase the flexibility of the economy. And I think it's instructive for other countries that may face similar challenges. In the run-up to the global financial crisis, this country and its lenders, seduced by the low rates and ample credit availability that came with currency union, generated an overheating of demand, an unsustainable real estate bubble, and rapidly rising private debt. Wage growth outstripping productivity led to a 30% faster increase in Spain's unit labor costs compared with countries like Germany, ultimately making exports uncompetitive. By 2012, output was plummeting along with real estate prices, the construction industry had crashed, and unemployment was above 25%, higher for young people. Banks were failing, and the government's fiscal policy was eroding rapidly as it sought to combat the crisis. Fortunately, Spain had a significant fiscal buffer at the time, in the form of its modest pre-crisis public debt, and that helped address the aftermath. Now, Spain's membership in the European Monetary Union meant that the standard counter-cyclical policy responses of exchange rate devaluation and loose monetary policy were not available to Spanish authorities. I don't want to make light of Europe's eventual contribution to Spanish recovery. The ECB crucially opened the money supply taps in 2012, and the ESM helped to restore financial stability. These supportive policies from Europe were important catalysts in Spain's recovery. But as a member of a currency union, overheating and with a loss of competitiveness, that left Spain facing the daunting task of achieving an internal devaluation, which is really economic adjustment with your hands tied behind your back. As you know, this was accomplished with tough fiscal measures and labor market reforms that supported wage moderation and greater employer flexibility. Bank restructuring reduced NPLs and shifted lending to more productive purposes. So Spain used its buffers and it created flexibility where it was most needed to improve its external competitiveness. I think the results speak for themselves. Growth at more than 3% for the last 3 years. GDP at a level above its pre-crisis level. It's also worth noting that per capita GDP in PPP terms has reached an all-time high here in Spain. With its recent acceleration, Spain is steadily making up for losses suffered during the crisis in the convergence process towards living standards of the richer European economies. Exports relative to GDP are now 10 percentage points above where they were in 2007. The economy is more competitive, with the cost of Spain's exports relative to its trading partners reduced nearly by 15% in real terms. In contrast, countries like Germany and France saw little movement after the crisis. And most importantly, 1.8 million jobs have been created, about half of those lost in the crisis, and about a fourth of all euro area job creation in the past 4 years. Regrettably, of course, youth unemployment remains stubbornly high. Spain's successful response to crisis demonstrates that internal adjustment within a monetary union is in fact possible. It was a difficult adjustment particularly for the Spanish people. But the Spanish economy, the Spanish economic house, was in danger of collapsing in a storm, and Spain managed to shore it up. Now the global and European economies are recovering and strengthening. So as we like to say at the IMF, it's time to fix the roof while the sun is shining. Taking bold measures during crisis, as Spain did, is very difficult. But taking bold measures during good times can be even more difficult because at times political urgency is just not what is needed. But that's where Spain stands right now. The reform imperative is, of course, to preserve what's been accomplished so far, but also to avoid losing momentum, to push ahead. The strong economic performance seen over the past few years masks weaknesses that still leave the country's economy vulnerable to shocks. Today, with the sun shining on the global economy, Spain is receiving some lift from the global economy and from strong foreign demand. This is not a time to take global demand for granted. It's likely that the medium term will bring some slowdown. The present recovery has a strong cyclical component. As that cycle proceeds, global interest rates are headed higher and financial conditions tighter. At the same time, the multilateral trade system, which has been a source of growth and jobs for millions of people, is subject to new threats amidst trade actions. In short, downside risks are accumulating. So that's where bolstering Spanish defenses and rebuilding buffers that were so critical to smoothing the process of adjustment becomes important for the future. Fiscal reserves that were essential during the crisis still need to be rebuilt. In particular, public debt is still close to 100% of GDP, almost 3 times on the eve of crisis. That debt burden needs to be reduced. In simple terms, the fiscal adjustment is just not finished. Future adjustments can be gradual, but they should be persistent and they should be structural in nature. The private sector, too, has more to do to strengthen its own balance sheets. The process of removing NPLs and distressed assets from bank books needs to continue, and weaker firms with high debt levels still need to strengthen their balance sheets. At the same time, there's the need for greater flexibility in labor markets to provide the new engine of growth for Spain. While job growth is strong, the unemployment rate remains about 16.5%, and more than twice that for the young. More than 40% of all unemployed have been without a job for over a year. And too many jobs are temporary, with nearly half of the new hires being employed on a temporary basis. This keeps productivity and wages too low in too many sectors. While the impact of the informality in the economy is hard to pinpoint, Spain surely has unfinished business in the area of labor market reform. That reform is sure to be difficult, as it was in the past, but I think it should be viewed fundamentally as an opportunity. Active labor market policies could put more people to work and help young people get a leg up. Easing conditions for employers to rely less on fixed-term contracts would encourage more investment in workers' human capital. In fact, I think the stakes are bigger than ever because the future of work is uncertain and sure to be in flux for many years into the future. The whole world faces the immense challenge of adapting to the transformative effects of new technology, automation, artificial intelligence, e-commerce, fintech, in the form of both e-credit and distributed ledger technology. All of these are new and are providing rapid change and really seeing the opportunities but seeing the disruptive effects of these technologies will take a long time. So for countries to take advantage of the digital economy and advances in artificial intelligence and other technologies, they really need to build a policy foundation that embraces and enables change. This applies, I think, to advanced and emerging market economies alike. There's really little time for hesitation or for distraction. Jack Ma, the founder and chairman of Alibaba, recently quipped that in this world of breakneck pace of change, if you're 3 years behind, you're a century behind. And I think that's something to bear in mind. His point is clear. Only countries who have their policy act together can create the right climate for new technology, for new business, and flourish and be the source of newfound wealth. So what to do? Spain needs to equip its young people with the higher productivity skills that tech-oriented businesses will demand. That means resources for education and training, resources that will only come from sound fiscal policies that make room for investing in human capital. Labor markets need to be more flexible so that businesses can respond to a rapidly evolving marketplace. When companies are nimble and they're flexible, they can combine capital, technology, and people in new ways, generating growth and jobs for all employees and communities. These are issues that Spain has in common with many other European countries. Everyone's grappling with this same structural problem. How to get ahead when the price of failure is lost competitiveness, lost opportunity to raise income levels, and potentially a lost generation of people. Ongoing reforms are essential for countries that hope to keep up in the global competition for markets. How countries respond to today's very hard realities may end up determining who wins and who loses. Aging workforces, inequality, lack of competition in product and service markets, misallocation of resources through the banking system, insufficient research and development. Europe faces all of these realities. And then there are the new opportunities, online retailing, third-party mobile payments, fintech, big data. Countries must position themselves now for investing tomorrow. And that leaves little space for failing to address the structural legacies laid bare by the financial crisis. So in conclusion, Spain has in many respects made more progress than many other European countries. Now, taking on difficult and comprehensive reforms is a path Spain needs to follow if it wishes to avoid falling behind. The combination of strong buffers and increased flexibility were essential to getting Spain through crisis and remain essential for navigating the future. The strong growth that you're experiencing represents the fruits of reform, the success of policies that introduce flexibility in the economy. But if Spain's commitment to reform slackens, it's hard to see higher growth being sustained in the future. The key to future dynamism is the continued pursuit of flexibility to encouraging innovation and strengthening competitiveness and resilience. Now, clearly, this requires more than any one country can itself guarantee. Global partners must avoid sudden shocks, and that includes threats to world trade coming from protectionism. Europe must continue to strengthen the architecture of integration. But Spain has its own challenges that it must address to enable it to ride the winds of change. We at the IMF look forward to being Spain's partners on that journey. Thank you.
Well done. Very interesting. Right. Okay, well, I'm going to be taking questions and putting my own questions, and hopefully we can have an interesting conversation. So in your presentation, you basically described a journey from 2012 till now. 2012, I'm sure a lot of people here remember as a rough year. 2018, we see a very strong recovery, but I guess just like in any recovery, you want to know how much of it is structural, how much of it is just cyclical. And I guess in your view at the IMF, what is the biggest weakness for the Spanish economy right now?
First, let me say that we've looked very general in preparing the work for the World Economic Outlook that's going to be coming out in the course of the next few weeks. We've looked at the question of how much of this global recovery for advanced economies, for emerging market economies, is cyclical, and how much is structural. And I think our view is that it's about 2/3, 1/3. That there is enough investment going on that will strengthen capital stocks and provide some more solid foundation for potential growth in the future. And that's roughly the 1/3. It may be that the cyclical portion is actually a little lower in advanced economies, but we haven't looked at it really on a country-by-country basis. You know, I think that for Spain, there's clearly more cyclical recovery to come. I think the output gap is near closed, but with unemployment remaining so high, you know, it may be that unlocking that requires structural change, the kind of labor market reforms that you heard about in the previous session. But the good news is that absorbing people into the economy or creating circumstances under which they can transit from informality to formality, from temporary jobs to permanent jobs, may mean putting people in positions where their work will have higher productivity and will lead to higher growth. So there, you know, while it's something that requires further structural change, it's something that can be a substantial enhancement to growth.
And are you concerned about the fact that the pace of reforms has really slowed down? That's not just in Spain, but in Europe overall. But there is a sense, like you mentioned, that now things are going well. It is the time to take those measures. But in terms of the politics, we're really not there.
I think it's hard to say. In general, it is, as I suggested in my speech, very easier to say than to do, to fix the roof while the sun is shining. When the pressure's off, there's less urgency to act. I think, though, that when one looks around in Europe, one sees countries that are, in fact, acting. I think France is an example of that. Here, I think the verdict remains out. I understand, you know, there are political elements here with the government trying to enact a budget and some delays in that process. So I don't want to draw any judgments one way or the other. I think the need is clear. The point of my speech was to suggest that this is the time to power ahead, that Spain needs to do so, that the world will be changing very quickly, that the future is uncertain. And I think in looking back a few years from now, if Spain acts, it will be very pleased to have done so.
And like you mentioned, I guess the point of this conference is to look at Spain and say, what lessons can we learn from this experience, especially in a European context? So 2018 is meant to be the big year of years and reform. I know the IMF last week announced new measures. I was wondering if you could first just let us a little bit know about what these measures are, just the order of priority, and how do you get politicians to get their act together and do it? Because there is a sense that Europe, there's stimulus, but that's going to end, and bad policy is still rocking the boat.
Well, there are things Europe needs to do at the European level with the cooperation and encouragement of all of its member countries, especially in the Eurozone. Christine Lagarde spoke about the Eurozone architecture. There are a host of reforms that have been done, others underway, but creating for the banking system a more complete banking union with deposit insurance, with a better resolution mechanism for banks, with a fiscal backstop for such a process. is one. Working towards creating a unified capital market is another. Both of those first two items, I think, are really necessary for efficiency's sake. If there's going to be really a true pan-European system of financial intermediation, so that the savings of savers gets channeled to the most efficient uses, you have to have both a well-functioning banking system that's pan-European, as well as a unified capital market. The third is the central fiscal capacity. I know this is a subject much under discussion, and there are a range of different ideas for this. The idea that Christine Lagarde put forward is a rainy day fund. The idea of that fund is to have some resources accumulate over time so that if there's an asymmetric shock and some part of the Eurozone is affected, that there's a way to buffer the economic decline. There's a way to make sure that we don't see the repetition of very harmful sovereign bank links that make recession deeper than necessary. And in our conception, there would be, as was mentioned this morning, there would be a requirement that national policy is the first line of defense, but that this would be a way of cushioning the decline. And we think that even with a fairly modest fund over a number of years, roughly half of the shock of a recession could be buffered through such a fund. So there are things to be done at the European level, but I think as well, the lessons that I want to draw, and I think they are important for other countries facing similar challenges, are to deal with fiscal problems, to pursue structural change that makes labor markets more flexible, and for countries, and there are others in Southern Europe, where labor costs have been allowed to drift up faster than productivity, and where competitiveness has been impeded, to use Spain as an example and to try to find ways to bring about internal devaluation. This is all part of a process of a convergence of productivity levels across Europe, which will make the entire zone more stable. But also to build fiscal buffers that will allow each national government to be in a position to be countercyclical when and if the time comes.
Right. I want to just ask a really quick question before you can ask questions, and I'm sure you're not going to be surprised. It's about markets and the big topic in the markets, which is trade. So we're seeing a lot of people getting really nervous. They don't like the language that we're seeing from the Trump administration. They don't like targeting specific countries, China and so on. Are you concerned about that? I guess the best risk is if this turns into a global trade war. Is that something that you contemplate?
As Christine Lagarde has said, and I think we all agree, nobody wins a trade war. But let me back up and say that we all have to understand that trade and technological change are leading to disruptions in the United States, in European economies, and that's having political manifestation in the voting booth. Whether it's what's happened in the United States or what one sees in Europe of the loss of popularity of centrist parties and growing popularity of parties on the wings. That's a real discontent. It comes from the reality of winners and losers. We've been saying for a couple of years that this aspect of globalization and these results of technological change should be the subject of policymakers' attention. Okay. Now, when in the case of the United States, the discontent has focused on trade, and this administration is doing what it's doing. But what's important, I think, I'd say two things are important. One is that countries like China that are the subject of the criticism, since they need globalization, it's what's enabled their huge success, and it's what gives them the potential for continued growth. Since they need globalization, they need to make sure that they back a form of globalization that is durable. And that means they need to acknowledge and address trade practices of their own that are problematic, that were not a global issue when China was a modest-sized trillion-dollar economy in the year 2000, but are really now a global issue when they're a $12 trillion economy in 2018. That said, we'd like to see discussions about the inadequacies of trade policy focused not on protection, but rather on increasing market access, on increasing trade. Trade growth has been slower than GDP growth pretty much from the global financial crisis until last year. Now, that with recovery, that's reverted. Trade growth is between 5 and 7% in the last couple of years. And it's spreading recovery. It's part of the solution. And we should do all we can to enhance trade growth through increasing market access and dismantling barriers to trade. And it's best that that be done through a process of cooperation, dialogue, and problem solving rather than through protection, because as we've seen in the last week, even modest-sized trade actions tend to beget retaliation.
Okay, so are there any, go ahead.
Hi, Diego coming from Dartmouth College. You have mentioned a couple of times unit labor costs and how they have been increasing in Spain, and you have put the emphasis on wages. But if you look at wages and salaries, they haven't increased as much. Basically, by and large, they have increased rates comparable to nominal GDP. The problem has been productivity. And so, productivity is one of those things that international institutions, because typically they don't understand it very well, they just mention it, they claim it's important, but then they put the emphasis somewhere else. I'm worried that policymakers often do that. What's your answer to that claim?
Yeah. It's the history of what's just happened in Spain is complex. It has many parts, but there was a period where the labor shedding led to increased productivity because with fewer people and the same amount of equipment, there was somewhat higher productivity. But in recovery, the stimulus to demand that came partly from the foreign demand and partly from domestic demand led to recovery that was where output growth was faster than employment growth. And that rise in productivity was not passed along to workers. And that's why unit labor costs fell in the last 4 years. This is not the case in all countries. There are places where wage growth tends to be faster than productivity growth, in essence, no matter the circumstance. So I think this happened in the years following labor market reform, which is not to say that the reforms, as was just pointed out towards the end of the last session, it's not to say that the new mechanisms in the reforms were used, but rather that they served as a backdrop against which bargaining took place and against which wage contracting was done. And the fact of the matter was that wages rose in a more gradual way than productivity, and so competitiveness improved. It's really quite a dramatic change where, say, Spain's unit labor costs, much like Italy's, had risen by 30% more than in Germany. Now Spain's is back very close to where France is in relative terms. Italy's still at the very high end of the spectrum, near where they've been for almost a decade. So I think it is a significant accomplishment. But exactly how this works out in the future is really for Spain to determine. I do think that more flexibility for firms and more active labor market policies can help ensure that going forward, not one to say exactly what is, it's very hard to say what is the right wage path It will differ from time to time, from sector to sector, from firm to firm. What's important is that there's a foundation, a framework in which employers and employees can come to agreements that will lead to sustained profitability, sustained competitiveness, and sustained growth.
We have time for one more question.
Antonio Pascual, Barclays Research. Something on fiscal issues. There seems to be a lot of debate still within Europe and the euro area on the amount of risk sharing versus risk reduction first. I'm here thinking about France and Germany. And I guess one question that I have on this is the issue of sovereign debt restructuring. I think this is something that it's a very sensitive issue. Of course, the crisis has still been very recent, but it's something that within the context of more risk sharing, something that Germany has put forward. However, there's been also pushback from, among others, mainly from France, arguing that that could be more of a problem than a solution because it can create, if not well designed, lead to more speculative attacks. So be more of a problem than a solution. What is your view on that? What is the type of system that we need to put in place before this kind of mechanism should be put in place? I know the IMF has done a lot of work on this in the past and have thought a lot about it. By the way, just final comment, I think part of the solution also is probably this new fiscal system that Ms. Lagarde mentioned. In my opinion, I think one of the best and more, feasible and plausible proposals that I've seen recently.
Let me say two different things. First, I think if we've learned anything at the IMF in the last 50 or so years, it's that sometimes countries get into debt difficulties, whether from their own actions or bad luck, and there's a need to have restructurings. And it's better when it comes to do it sooner rather than later, because the overhang of great amounts of debt can be a tremendous disincentive for investment, for growth. But exactly how you work out and devise such a system is complex. I'm not going to venture particulars. But on the question of risk sharing and risk reduction, I think one has to start with some sympathy for those who believe that if you jump straight to risk sharing in a system that's not actuarially fair, that will disadvantage them. And that's true whether you're talking about deposit insurance or whether you're talking about rainy day funds, stabilization mechanisms. And so to some extent, the legacies of the past, which leave some countries in greater need at the present time, cloud the consideration of how to devise risk-sharing mechanisms. That's a difficulty at the present moment, and it has to be sorted out. What I think does make sense is finding some way to devise risk-sharing systems where everyone gains in the expectational sense, meaning you don't know whether your country, your business will be hit with a shock, and where you may be in need of some support from the rest of the Eurozone. And in that setting, you're willing to, one way or another, contribute to what is, in essence, an insurance-based mechanism. And in that sense, everyone gains. Of course, it has to be set up with rules and procedures so that there aren't incentives for the overuse of the system. There isn't moral hazard. I think the proposal that Ms. Lagarde has made is carefully designed in that respect. So I think it makes sense for Europe to move forward to try to devise this, but I think we all need to acknowledge that the legacies of crisis create some fair concern on the part of those who view themselves as, at the present moment, being asked to participate in a system that's not likely to be actuarially fair. I think that problem can be addressed, but it really must be.
I want to ask you, if I may, just a really quick question, which is a big topic in the market and the global economy, and it's the fact that this year so far we've seen two big tantrums in stocks mostly. And they're pegged to mostly volatility, but that's also pegged to this idea of inflation, which everyone now seems to be surprised about. So I'm just wondering, if this new environment continues and it becomes a new status quo, is the global economy at risk? Are people prepared to operate in this new environment?
First, volatility, say, in the U.S. stock market has been at very low levels. And partly that's because, as in Europe, that's because of the very helpful role that monetary accommodation and the liquidity that's been created by that creates. I think it's useful that there have been reminders that volatility has not been banished from the world. There are sure to be more consequential shocks than anything we have seen in the last few months. And it's useful that market participants, some of whom are young enough that they've never really experienced major downturns, to understand as they are making their market calculus that volatility could well be back, and to factor that in. I think that the market reactions are one thing. The question is whether there are self-inflicted wounds that come from, say, the trade policies and the risks that people feel that there may be about retaliation and an escalation of trade actions, and so that's something that through dialogue and cooperation should be avoided. The other big subject that you hint at, of course, is the normalization of monetary policy. There, if anything, I think we should all be pleasantly surprised that in the United States, where normalization has gone, through six interest rate increases, that this has happened fairly smoothly. It's been communicated fairly clearly, and the markets have not seen something disruptive. That's not to say that as inflation gets back to or even goes above target for a while, that might not happen. But I think so far it's a pretty good result. I think that normalization is at a much earlier stage elsewhere, and I mean, in the UK it's more advanced, but it's at a much earlier stage here in Europe and in Japan, and we'll need to be alert to the possibility that there are surprises in the extent to which the resurgence of demand leads to a resurgence in inflation, and that central banks may have to respond, and that as they do so, that market reactions, the reemergence of term premia may have to be digested by the markets. But I think I would say so far pretty well handled.
Right, so you appear to be much more concerned about trade than volatility. People should get used to volatility.
I think we should, look, I think we need to be, I think the volatility, just to be clear, the volatility we have seen so far, including in the last few days, is while volatility yesterday in the U.S. stock market was high compared to the last few years, it's still low by a longer historical standard. I think we need to be alert that volatility could be a much bigger factor under certain scenarios in the future.
Great, well, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.